Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Voices, a Library Lecture Series. We'd like to begin with an acknowledgement that we are gathered on the sacred homelands of the Mahikiniak or Mohican people who are the stewards of this land. Today, the community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present. Voices presents speakers on timely and enduring issues each semester to broaden and enrich the scope of studies at Hudson Valley Community College. Please fill out a survey at the link on our first slide or on our social media platforms. These help to inform our future programming. Today, Voices presents Susan Arbetter, the host of Spectrum News' Capitol Tonight. Previously, she served as the host of WCNY's The Capitol Press Room. Among many other honors, Arbetter is an inductee of the Women's Press Club of New York Hall of Fame. Please welcome Susan Arbetter.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you for everybody who's tuning in. It's a special honor to be here at HVCC's Voices Library Lecture Series. Again, my name is Susan Arbetter, and I'm going to be talking about politics today without really any bells or whistles, no slide presentation, no PowerPoint, no baking in a tent, no puppies. It's just going to be you and me and this microphone. You've been forewarned. When the good folks here at Hudson Valley asked me to discuss the 2020 elections back in, I think it was December, I thought, great, I can do a straightforward speech on the state's legislative and congressional races, throw in some national stuff, a little color. It'll be a breeze, comparing policy platforms and the political acumen or the lack thereof of certain candidates. Thought it would be pretty simple, but that was before COVID killed over 200,000 Americans, before the most raucous presidential debate in history, before the FBI foiled a plot by a militia group to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer because of actions she took to limit the spread of the virus, before riots began in Orthodox Jewish enclaves in Brooklyn over wearing masks, and before Don Lewinsky, who was a regular at Pamp's Red Zone Bar and Grill in West Seneca, New York, allegedly shoved an 80-year-old man so hard that his head hit the floor and he lost consciousness. The victim, Rocco Sapienza, underwent brain surgery, but he later died. The cause of the fracas? Don Lewinsky was asked to wear a mask. That happened less than 2 weeks ago in Buffalo. So I can't talk about the 2020 elections without talking about COVID and why this virus has become so politicized. Let's start with a little data proving that fact. There is a great group called Civics, and they do a lot of polling, and they do it with graphs and things like that. One of their graphs compares how concerned Americans are about the virus by various demographics. So Civics tracking goes back to March, and it goes to the current day. When I wrote this on Saturday, it was up to date. So this data are up to date right now. If you go to the site and you start clicking around, what you find is that there are deep divisions, deep political divisions in how Americans view COVID. Check this out. Democrats with some postgraduate education, so these are pretty educated people, have a net concern about the virus of 77%. Republicans with that equal amount of education, some postgraduate education, had a net concern of negative 36%. That's a differential of over 100%. You add, if you factor in less education, the numbers become slightly more divergent. Democrats with a college degree, not post-college, had a net concern of 76%. Republicans with a college degree had a net concern of negative 42%. Democrats no college, net concern 74%. Republicans with no college, net concern of negative 50%. It's almost as if Republicans and Democrats are getting their information about the virus from two completely different media ecosystems, which of course they are. There's this great graph. Maybe I should someday bring some slides, but there's a graph that some firm put out about media bias. On the top, it's political bias, and on the edge, it's reliability. And right down the middle at the very top, you have the AP, you have Reuters, you have the New York Times, you have the Washington Post, the best news organizations on the planet, basically BBC, PBS. Then you have, a little bit on the left, you have like MSNBC, you have The Nation, you have a little bit on the right, you have Fox, and you have Newsmax and the Washington Times. So we are getting our information from two totally different ecosystems, and here's an example of what I'm talking about. According to Pew Research, Republicans trust Fox News, which is a little to the right, more than any other outlet. Democrats distrust it more than any other news outlet. 65% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say that they trust Fox News for political and election news. No more than a third of Republicans say they trust any other news organization asked about in this survey. The more conservative you are as a Republican, the less likely you are to trust any other news source than Fox, or other liberal news sources. Other sources, I should say. Sorry about that. 3/4 say this, compared with around half of moderate or liberal Republicans. So if you're conservative and you watch Fox, you believe them. Among Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents, 61% say they distrust Fox News for political news. And more liberal Democrats are far more likely than conservative or moderate Democrats to say that they distrust Fox News. So what am I trying to say here? What does this have to do with the coronavirus? Well, a lot, actually. According to Pew, those who named Fox News as their main source of political news not only have an especially positive view of President Trump, but also of the president's handling of the pandemic. In a March survey, almost 2/3 of those who say that their main source of political and election news is Fox say Trump is doing an excellent job responding to the outbreak. No more than a quarter of those who cited other news outlets as their main source of political news said this. Fox News watchers were considerably more likely than Republicans overall to describe Trump's handling of the outbreak as excellent. So Americans who are already divided are getting their news from different sources and have different views of the president's response to COVID, but it's also more than that. I found this fascinating. In May, a writer named Jesse Singal wrote in New York Magazine about a theory called cultural cognition. It's an area of study at Yale. I mean, it's not, BS, it's for real. And it refers to the tendency of individuals to conform their beliefs about disputed matters of fact to values that define their cultural identities. So Singal smartly used the example of climate change, and I'm going to paraphrase a psychologist that Singal was writing to via email from Texas Tech. She said that, quote, views toward the topic of climate change have become so entwined with people's political identification, and here's where I'm paraphrasing, that when conservatives hear that effects of climate change are becoming more severe, it threatens their political core beliefs. Likewise, any information that sounds like the effects of climate change are less severe directly affects the political liberals' core beliefs. And we all know what happens when our beliefs are threatened. It's like the world is tilting off its axis. And of course, we push back. The way a lot of people push back is by minimizing or dismissing the information that doesn't align with their view of the world. Another term for this is calling something fake news. Not surprisingly, these beliefs inform the way we act. Back in March, another writer that I like, McKay Coppins, wrote in The Atlantic, across the country, social distancing is morphing from a public health to a political act, and the consequences could be disastrous. As it turned out, he was spot on. With the president's call for a quick return to business as usual and repeated refrains like, "We can't let the cure be worse than the problem," President Trump has fanned the flames of this cultural divide to a point where some of the people who are aching to see us return to normal aren't wearing masks, are disdainful of social distancing, and are delaying the very normalcy that they so desire. It's really perverse for a public health crisis. So has this division affected New York? Well, the answer is absolutely. Little background now. New York is a Democratic state. As of February 1st, among total registered voters in New York, the State Board of Elections showed that there were 6.4 million registered Democrats, 2.9 million registered Republicans, so there were more than twice as many Democrats than Republicans registered in New York. Of course, those are not the only people who will be voting on November 3rd. There are also unaffiliated voters like myself, 2.8 million unaffiliated voters. Plus, there are about 700,000 voters who are signed up with third parties like the Green Party, Libertarian, Conservative, Working Families parties. Did I mention Libertarian? Greens. Here in the Capital Region, the Times-Union reported on Saturday that more than 200,000 additional voters were active and registered as of September of this year, in comparison to September of 2016, quote, an increase attributable in large part to Democratic registrations. That calculation could be different in Republican-leaning regions of the state. So take Shenango County, okay? It's in the southern tier. There were about 30,000 registered voters in Shenango County. 2/3 of them are Republicans. Well, I did not learn if Shenango's small population of Democrats had grown. I did learn from the Daily Star that Shenango sent out more than 4,500 absentee ballot requests this year. 4 years ago, they only had 2,000. According to USA Today, Democrats account for 55% of the people who have voted by mail across 7 early swing states where voters register by party. And these states include Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. These are important, critical states for the presidential election. Republicans only accounted for 24% of voters who are voting by mail. Voters who are unaffiliated made up 20%. Why is this important? Well, on Sunday, the bottom line is that Democratic voters are very excited and energized about the 2020 race. It's not clear if Republicans are yet, but we do know that Republicans don't trust mail-in ballots. Why is that? Well, it could be in large part because President Trump has repeatedly said that they're not to be trusted, that there will be ballot rigging. This is completely unsubstantiated. Again, from the New York Times, officials from both parties say that Democrats are far more eager to vote early to avoid possibly exposing themselves to the virus at Election Day polling sites. Many Republicans have followed the lead of Mr. Trump, who has regularly castigated voting by mail, while the party's leadership in some states has offered mixed messages about when voters should vote, when supporters should vote, rather. A moment now on election integrity. If you take nothing away from this talk, I hope that you remember this. For months, the president has been laying the groundwork to claim that if he loses the election, it must be because the election was rigged. In fact, he stated this blatantly in August. He said, and this is a quote, "The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged." Remember that. We have to be very careful. The only way they, the Democrats, are going to win is that way, and we can't let it happen. The president is specifically targeting mail-in voting, claiming it's dangerous, this is a quote, "dangerous for this country because of cheaters." So he's saying that it's an invitation to fraud. This is what you need to take away from this. That is a false allegation. That is a false allegation. There is no widespread rigging of the American presidential election. In the US, our elections are discrete events that are done county by county. They are not linked online, like, let's say, a banking system. And there's also no evidence that there has ever been widespread fraud. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU has done a meticulous review of elections going back decades, elections that had been investigated for voter fraud, and they found that it's exceedingly rare. Yes, it happens sometimes, but it's a handful of people, typically at the local level. It happened, for example, in 2015, right here in New York, in a small community called Bloomingburg. 4 people in Bloomingburg conspired to falsely register non-residents to vote in the village election. Their goal was to elect board members who would favor their planned housing development project. But this kind of voter fraud is not systematic, okay? It's typically limited to very local elections like that village election in Bloomingburg. Another database that tracks voter fraud, created by the Conservative Heritage Foundation, found fewer than 1,300 proven cases of voter fraud have taken place in the US since 1982. I was in high school in 1982. It's a long time ago. What there has been is plenty of allegations of voter fraud. This again from the Brennan Center. In 2018, Florida Governor Rick Scott claimed that there was rampant fraud in his U.S. Senate race, but that claim was rejected by law enforcement officials and election monitors from his own administration. That pattern has repeated itself again and again. Excuse me, I have allergies. In 2002, then Attorney General John Ashcroft created the Voting Access and Integrity Initiative, which aggressively investigated voter fraud allegations as one of the top priorities of the Justice Department. After 5 years, however, the U.S. Department of Justice found little evidence of fraud, and in 2007, the New York Times reported that only about 120 people were charged and 86 convicted of election-related crimes, despite hundreds of millions of votes being cast during the period under investigation. And of course, we all remember Chris Kobach's voter fraud commission, which failed to uncover any voter fraud. So while fraud happens infrequently, the consequences of constantly yelling fraud, fraud, fraud are very serious. Here's why. They result in more restrictive voting laws, lower levels of trust in our elections. I mean, basically, it's damaging democracy. They have been used to justify voter ID laws, overly aggressive voter roll purges, and this hurts disenfranchised voters already. All that's stated, there are some very politically astute strategies for the president to foster this doubt in the elections. Politically astute meaning that they may work. First, more Democrats are expected to vote this year by mail than Republicans. We already know that. We've already talked about that. One of the whys can be answered by the graph from Civics that I spoke about earlier, the one that showed that more Democrats than Republicans are concerned about the virus. They don't want to go to the polls to vote on Election Day because they fear they might get infected. The second reason the president is going after mail-in voting is an offshoot of the first. There's a phenomenon known as the blue shift, in which Republican candidates who are ahead on election night, so stay with me, they're ahead on election night because Republicans seem to want to come to the polls to cast their ballot. And then the blue shift is that they see their leads diminish over time after the mail-in ballots are counted. A New Yorker article cited in a 2018 tweet from President Trump in which he seems to reference the blue shift. This is what he tweeted. The Florida election, this is the one with Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis, should be called in favor of Rick Scott and Ron DeSantis in that large numbers of new ballots showed up out of nowhere, and many ballots are missing or forged. An honest vote count is no longer possible. Ballots massively infected must go with election night. So the idea of going with election night has ignited some almost hysterical fears from Democrats that this blue shift could lead President Trump to declare victory before the vote is certified, and then use the conservative media, specifically Fox News and its brethren on the right, Breitbart, Newsmax, to hammer home that message. This is backed up by a new poll released just this week by the Justice Collaborative. It showed that Republican voters will trust President Trump if he declares himself the winner on November 3rd, before all the votes are counted. Additionally, Republican voters overwhelmingly trust Fox News. We've already established that, but not the other broadcast networks, not CNN, not ABC, NBC, CBS, either the cable networks or the broadcast networks. They don't trust them to call the results of the presidential election. Not so with Democrats. A strong majority of Democratic voters would trust the broadcast news networks to call the election. They would also trust cable companies, CNN, MSNBC, not Fox, however, to call the results of the presidential election. While concerning, and it is concerning, the legal director of the Government Law Center at Albany Law School, Richard Rifkin, reminded me that regardless of what the president or anybody else, Joe Biden, anybody else says on election night, or what talk show hosts like Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow say on election night, under the Constitution, under the Constitution, the Electoral College chooses the president. Not Rachel Maddow, not Sean Hannity, not Joe Biden, not Donald Trump. Still, the uncertainty surrounding this election has even one veteran poll watcher really worried. I talked to this guy, Professor William Banks from Syracuse. He is a professor of law and public affairs at Syracuse, and he told me, quote, "On a scale from 1 to 10, I'd say my worry about this presidential election is about a 9. Think about that. This guy is definitely in his 60s, perhaps 70s. He's seen a lot of elections. He went on to describe several plausible scenarios that could cause this election to go off the rails. One such scenario, so think about this. Remember, if Republicans don't trust absentee ballots, there may be Republican elections officials who say no, no, no to certain absentee ballots. So if there are partisan fighting around absentee ballots in key swing states like Pennsylvania, God forbid, Florida, like we had in 2000, and they don't get their votes into the Electoral College by December 14th, which is the date, that electors meet and cast their ballots for president and vice president, what's going to happen? Well, Professor Banks explained that if neither candidate gets to 270 electoral votes, that's the magic number, the election would be decided by the House of Representatives. Now, on January 6th, the House of Representatives will come together, and this is from all of the, with the new Congress people who have just been elected on November 3rd. Congress will take its own vote at that point. And from what I understand, it will work like this. Each state would determine which candidate had won their electoral votes, and they would pass that information along to the House. The House will then vote one vote per state. This is according to Professor Banks. And so there are 50 potential votes. Because there are more Republican-controlled states than democratically controlled states, the Republicans would prevail. There are 79 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day. And that means that there's a lot of potential for mischief on both sides of the political aisle. And most of that mischief will likely end up in court. I recently spoke with Danny Alter, a former assistant U.S. attorney in Manhattan. He's a former Coker Fellow in constitutional law at Yale Law School. He said that judicial intervention carries a lot of moral authority. But he followed that up with this quote. As Andrew Jackson once reportedly said in derogation of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. That's pretty scary, considering the Supreme Court does not have its own army. Speaking of the Supreme Court, think about this. If the presidential election is decided by the nation's highest court, will the American people accept its decision the way it did in 2000? Remember, Al Gore did cede the election. He stated that he lost the election, and so Democrats who backed Al Gore sort of had tacit permission to step away from the fight. Don't think that's going to happen this year. If things come down to the way they were in 2000 and the Supreme Court decides the fate of the election, every expert I have spoken with has said, no, the American people will not respond the way they did in 2000. The Supreme Court is viewed the way everything is nowadays, seemingly through the scrim of Republican and Democratic politics. It's also not 2000 anymore. It is, the horrible year of 2020, and we're a more divided country than we've been in recent times. So brace yourself. Here in New York, things are somewhat simpler. We are not a swing state. Again, we have twice as many Democrats as Republicans. And we know because of that overwhelming number of democratically enrolled voters that Joe Biden will almost certainly take New York's 29 electoral votes. So I wanted to take a look at some of the hot down ballot races. And weirdly, roll call, which is, everybody reads roll call in the political ecosystem, and they assessed what the top 10 most competitive races are in the country. 3 of them are right here in New York State. So that's sort of exciting. Again, allergies. Republican John Katko of the Syracuse area, who is neck and neck with Democrat Dana Balter, that's number 1, that's NY24. Democrat Anthony Brindisi of the Mohawk Valley, who is being challenged by Claudia Tenney, who used to hold the seat before Brindisi won over her in 2018. That's another really competitive seat. That's NY22. And Democrat Max Rose of Long Island, who is trying to fend off a challenge from former Republican Assemblywoman Nicole Malliotakis. All 3 of these are exciting to watch, and sometimes they've become a little bitter, but it's going to be very interesting to see how these play out. Closer to home, Paul Tonko's race, he's facing off against Republican Liz Joy. She's a fantastic candidate, but the Democratic enrollment advantage in that district will likely overwhelm her. In my opinion, of even more interest is the race for the 19th congressional district between Antonio Delgado, who is defending his first 2-year term, against a pretty interesting challenger, Republican Kyle Vandewater. He's an attorney, he's a military veteran, and he said that he is running because of the ongoing legal pursuit of President Trump by congressional Democrats. There's also a Green Party candidate, Stephen Greenfield, and a Libertarian candidate, Victoria Alexander, in the race. We'll see if Antonio Delgado can pull it out. You may remember that Delgado won 2 years ago against incumbent John Faso as part of the midterm elections, which generally favors the party that's out of power. So now Delgado has to defend his position. His party is still out of power, and Democrats, as I mentioned before, are very excited. So that's going to be an interesting race to watch. Like most of the House races this year, Delgado's future may depend on how voters in his district view the presidential candidates. They either like the presidential candidates, they don't like the presidential candidates, one or the other. Siena did a poll in NY24. That's the Balter-Katko race, which is in central New York and includes Syracuse. Support, according to the Siena poll, for Joe Biden is so strong in that district that it's boosting the challenger, Democrat Dana Balter. Meanwhile, President Trump is viewed unfavorably by 60% of voters in the 24th congressional district, and according to Siena, that includes 30% of Republicans. All of that is bringing the incumbent, John Katko's numbers, down. Even though he has some pretty good favorability ratings, people are sort of mushing President Trump and John Katko together in their mind. Now I want to share some thoughts with you about how COVID is affecting New York State's 2020 elections budget-wise. Because of the shutdown, the state of New York is, according to the Budget Office, facing a $14.5 billion budget gap this year. And over the course of the next 4 years, if nothing changes, that budget gap is going to grow to $62 billion. I know it's hard to wrap your mind around these huge numbers, but they're big. At the same time, because of COVID, New York has expanded its absentee ballot process. In May, county boards of election estimated that would cost an additional $50 million to implement that expansion and remain in compliance with COVID. So county boards of election this year, because of a new law that was passed last year, need to do a lot of new things. They need to, for example, print and post thousands of more absentee ballots because of COVID. They need to inform voters of their new voting choices. You can vote 3 ways this year. You can vote in person on Election Day, you can vote by absentee ballot, or you can vote in person early. And all the boards of election have to notify voters of all of this. But the boards of election hadn't budgeted for any of this. And the state being broke, can't pay for it. So how are boards of election paying for our elections? You're not going to believe this, but many have applied for private grant funding from an organization called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, which is partially funded by money from Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan. This is completely authorized by the state of New York. On September 4th, the New York State Board of Elections forwarded that grant application to all the county boards of election in New York State. And anecdotally, I understand that many counties have applied. I spoke with one Board of Election commissioner from Onondaga County, and he agreed that, applying for a private grant to fund the election was really, really weird. But he said, a drowning man looks for every branch he can find. In other words, they don't have any money, and they have these mandates from the governor and to make sure that all the poll workers have masks and that everything is clean, that they send out information to voters. Good government groups are less thrilled about this idea of Facebook having anything to do with New York's elections. Excuse me. Susan Lerner of Common Cause told me, quote, boards of elections should not have to plead for money with out-of-control billionaires who've wreaked havoc on our democracy. Doing so makes every New Yorker an unwitting co-conspirator in Mark Zuckerberg's pathetic attempt at image rehab. Facebook shouldn't be able to pay off the federal government, whose job it is to fund our elections. So here we are. It is less than 3 weeks out from what's been called the most important election in a generation. We're in the middle of a pandemic that's been politicized. Republicans and Democrats cannot agree on how dangerous COVID-19 is. The president who contracted COVID is stoking fear about the integrity of the elections. Many states have implemented restrictive voting rules, experts are worried that the presidential race will be decided by the courts. Facebook is paying for part of our election infrastructure. And I read in the New York Post the other day that there are venomous woolly caterpillars somewhere in the United States. That's enough for me. What the what? Won't 2020 end? If it feels like everything is sort of going to hell, take a deep breath, a socially distanced breath. I'll tell you what I tell myself after being steeped in this stuff for 12 hours, 14 hours every single day. And I believe this to be true. We all have to have faith in the American public. We need to have faith in the American people. FDR once wrote, "Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not a president and senators and congressmen and government officials, but the voters of this country." That said, I want to leave you with one more statistic, if you can bear it. If you have voted anywhere in America over the last 25 years, one thing you're certain to have noticed is the age of the poll workers. 70% are between the ages of 60 and 70. With COVID, many of these older poll workers are saying they don't want to volunteer this time around. They don't want to, even if they're paid, they're saying, I'm opting out this year because of COVID. So a group called Power the Polls went on a recruiting drive to find the next generation of poll workers. Their goal, their target was 250,000 poll workers between the ages of 18 and 35. They wanted 250,000. What they got? 450,000. That should warm your heart. It should warm your heart in the very same way that knowing more young people are paying attention to civic life warms mine. I urge you to fill out the census. I urge you to go vote. Thank you. And I think now we're going to take some questions. Thank you. So the first, who do you believe will win the 2020 presidential election? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. There are so many factors in play. The October surprise still might emerge. Even though it's 3 weeks out from the election, when it comes to politics, that's like dog years. Okay, it's years before the election. Anything can happen. And with the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle, anything could happen. So I don't know. Right now, Biden is up in several swing states, but he's up like 4%, 5%, 6%. Some of that is within the margin of error. What news source do you find to be the most trustworthy? You know what? One news source isn't going to do it for you. You need a panoply of news sources to go to. Read the New York Times. Read the Wall Street Journal. Go to, I read a lot. I read the Times Union. I read the Washington Post. I'll read the National Review. I read the Washington Times, which is supposedly right of center. I also will read like Mother Jones sometimes just to get more left-wing, The Nation. But generally speaking, down the middle, mainstream media, for all of its flaws, really does try. So ABC, NBC, CBS, the CNN, I think you'll be safe with those. But if you really want to become an educated person, read The Economist. Read The Hill. These are very good down-the-middle sort of sources. What are your thoughts on the Cobb-Stefanik race? it's a good race. I am pretty sure that Stefanik is going to pull it out. I mean, I'm not sure what her internal polling is saying, and I say that because she has been hammering Tedra Cobb, calling her Taxon Tedra and things like that, and just really pulling out all the stops to conquer what appears on the outside to be a small foe. I mean, Tedra Cobb is, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Tedra Cobb is not, she's a Democrat in an area that's traditionally a Republican-held seat. I don't know. We'll see. But if I had to bet right now, I would say Elise Stefanik pulls it out big time. And what are some of the other effects of national elections on local elections? Well, I'll just say one final thing, that the national story, the national, whatever issues nationally are in play usually trickle down to the public level. Look at the Affordable Care Act, look at COVID. So whoever wins sets the agenda, and that's what we will be talking about on Spectrum News. Are we good? Any more? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.